All right, hey guys and girls. Today we're going to cover the Chapter 15, Section 2 notes, which is the impact of Reconstruction. So we covered Section 1, which talked about the three phases of Reconstruction, congressional Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, then congressional Reconstruction, and then redemption with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. So today we're going to focus on the impact. It's going to cover key concepts 5.3.2c, efforts by radical and moderate Republicans to change the balance of power between Congress and the presidency and to reorder race relations in the defeated South yielded some short-term success. Reconstruction opened up political opportunities for other leadership roles to former slaves, but it ultimately failed due to both determined Southern resistance and the North's waning resolve. And 532D, Southern plantation owners continued to own the majority of the region's lands even after Reconstruction. Former slaves sought land ownership but generally fell short of self-sufficiency, as an exploitive and soil-intensive sharecropping system limited blacks and poor whites access to land in the South. All right, so I broke Section 2 down into three categories. We'll look at the impact on political and civil rights, the impact on education, and then the land and economic opportunity. So let's start with the immediate impact on political and civil rights for African Americans as a result of Reconstruction. Well, you're going to have a man pictured here, Hiram Revels. He'll become the nation's first African American senator in 1870 when he was elected by the Mississippi State Legislature. Mississippi will also send another African American man to the Senate, in Blanche K. Bruce, in 1874. However, with the redemption period of Reconstruction, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and the withdrawal of Union troops from the South, no African American would again serve on the Senate until Edward Brooke from Massachusetts in 1966. So while there is some short-term immediate gains for African Americans in the South, by the time Hayes is elected president, that pretty much comes to an end. And actually, even though they gained their freedom, they're going to lose much of their immediate privileges that they gained. You also have 20 African Americans serving in the House of Representatives during Reconstruction. Reconstruction state governments expanded the right to vote. They abolished restrictions that had existed for black and poor white voters prior. And newly formed state constitutions created public school systems and internal improvements designed to bring the South into the modern world. As I said, though, again, unfortunately for African Americans, these political and civil rights in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction are short-gained, because that once the Union troops withdraw from the South, Southern Democrats, white Democrats, regain control of the states and the legislatures. And we'll talk about the impact of that with the Jim Crow laws, the voting restrictions. So it ended up resulting in a disenfranchisement of African Americans. But the immediate impact of Reconstruction, they do make gains. All right, education. Following the Civil War, African Americans had an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and education. Literacy was a powerful symbol of freedom for African Americans, and we talked about that earlier when we talked about slavery this year. One important institution was the Freedmen's Bureau. They played a critical role in providing teachers, many of which came from the North, to join the freedmen. Both black and white teachers taught. The Freedmen's also founded many black colleges in the South that would train the teachers in a short course. Throughout the lifetime of the Freedmen's, the Bureau reported of the 3,000 teachers for the freedmen, the majority were now African American. And you can see an example of a early freedmen's school. So they're going to play a major role in the education of African Americans in the South. And then lastly, we have land and economic opportunity. Land was just as important, as the vote or education for African Americans, because land provided independent economic opportunity in which freedom existed and rested. When General Sherman and his army arrived in Savannah, Georgia, he quickly instituted the 40 acres and a meal program. So 40 acre parcels of land for black families, which was to be taken from the plantations of owners in active rebellion in Georgia. And then it was also later instituted in South Carolina. However, under President Andrew Johnson, he's going to quickly put an end to the 40 acres and a mule program. And many freed slaves found themselves working on the very same plantations where they had served as slaves, but they now earned wages. And this is where sharecropping comes in. It's going to become the new Southern economic arrangement, in which the landowner provided supplies to the land tenant, and in return the tenant gave the landowner a share of the crop. But sharecropping is such an important economic system in the South at the time. One could argue, and I would probably make the argument, that it really was, in a way, an economic continuation of slavery. So it's very important that you're familiar with it. And let's look at the sharecropping cycle of poverty here that it created. So if you look at step one, the sharecropper, which would be the former plantation owner, provided land and seed to the freed slave or the poor white. In exchange, that person promises the landowner half the crop. The sharecropper then, again, that's either the slave or poor white, had to buy food and clothing on credit from the plantation owner's store. The sharecropper then plants and harvests the crops. The sharecropper then gives the landowner the crop to sell. The sharecropper gets half the earning minus the cost of purchases for the year. Step 5, when settling up, the landowner says the sharecropper owes more than he has earned. And this is where a lot of former slaves were taken advantage of. Many did not know how to read or do math. So they could not check the math done from the landowner's store. They could not check the math from the profits. They weren't able to really read the agreement. Many times they ended up debt. And that's what's really going to create the cycle of poverty, as we see with step 6. To pay the debt, the sharecropper must promise landowner a greater share of next year's crop. So each year they just accumulate more and more debt to the landowner, and in a way they are now economic slaves to the land, where they were once working as slaves. So that's why one could argue the sharecropping system was an economic form of slavery. All right, guys and girls, that's a wrap for section 2, real short section, but quite a few important things to note. We'll continue with section 3 and 4, Reconstruction. We'll look more at picking up after Hayes' election, withdrawal of Union troops, and see how African Americans continue to be disenfranchised.